In the early 18th century, Britain looked south across its North American colonies and saw both an opportunity and a problem. The opportunity was the unclaimed land between the thriving port of Charleston, South Carolina, and Spanish-held Florida. The problem was Spain itself. Florida's garrisons at St. Augustine threatened the southern edge of British America, and London wanted a buffer zone, one that could also absorb England's growing population of debtors, the poor, and those seeking a fresh start. Out of these motives, in 1732, King George II granted a charter for the new colony of Georgia, named in his own honor. The man chosen to guide this experiment was James Oglethorpe, a soldier and philanthropist who believed the poor deserved a second chance. Oglethorpe and 20 other trustees envisioned Georgia as a place where honest but unfortunate debtors could rebuild their lives, free from the corruption and overcrowding of English cities. The trustees also hoped to create a disciplined, orderly society that would defend the more prosperous colonies to the north. From the start, Georgia was meant to be different. It would ban slavery and hard liquor, limit land ownership to small farms, and require every settler to serve as a citizen soldier in case of invasion. In February 1733, Oglethorpe and roughly 100 colonists landed at the mouth of the Savannah River. On a high bluff overlooking the water, they built the settlement of Savannah, carefully laid out in a grid of squares that still defines the city today. Oglethorpe worked diplomatically with the local Yamacraw, a small Creek group led by Tomochichi, and with the interpreter Mary Musgrove, who helped secure peace and trade. For a time, relations between native peoples and the newcomers remained unusually cooperative. The early years were harsh. The soil was poor for the kinds of crops the settlers knew, and the ban on rum and slavery made Georgia less attractive to migrants than neighboring South Carolina. The colonists petitioned the trustees for changes. Many argued that without enslaved labor, they could not compete with Carolina's profitable rice and indigo plantations. The trustees resisted, but by the 1750s, they were losing control. In 1752, they surrendered the charter, and Georgia became a royal colony under direct crown rule. Royal status brought sweeping change. Restrictions on slavery and land ownership were lifted, and planters poured in from Carolina and the Caribbean. Enslaved Africans soon formed a large portion of the population, and Georgia's economy began to mirror that of its neighbors built on rice, indigo, and later cotton. The coastal lowlands filled with plantations, while the backcountry remained rough and sparsely settled. Savannah grew into a thriving port, shipping the products of enslaved labor across the Atlantic. As prosperity grew, so did friction with the British government. Taxes and trade laws, the Navigation Acts, the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, stirred resentment. Georgia's merchants and planters were caught between loyalty and defiance. The colony had deep ties to Britain. Many settlers were recent immigrants, and royal protection had kept them safe from Spanish Florida and Creek attacks. Yet revolutionary ideas were spreading through pamphlets, sermons, and tavern talk. By the early 1770s, even cautious Georgians began to question imperial rule. When war broke out in 1775, Georgia hesitated. It was the youngest and smallest of the 13 colonies, with a divided population and few munitions. But after the skirmishes at Lexington and Concord, revolutionary committees seized control of local governments. In 1776, Georgia sent delegates to the Second Continental Congress, and Button, Gwinnett, Lyman Hall, and George Walton signed the Declaration of Independence on the colony's behalf. The Revolutionary War in Georgia was brutal. Loyalists and patriots often lived side by side, and the fighting pitted neighbor against neighbor. British forces captured Savannah in December 1778, turning it into a base for Southern operations. A joint Franco-American assault in 1779 failed to retake the city, and the Redcoat occupation continued until 1782. Inland, guerrilla warfare raged as militia bands harassed enemy patrols and Loyalist refugees fled toward Florida. The conflict devastated farms, towns, and trade, leaving deep scars that lasted well beyond independence. When peace came, Georgia was free but unstable. Its population had been scattered, its economy crippled, and its frontier insecure. Yet opportunity beckoned. Vast tracts of land lay to the west, stretching toward the Mississippi, land the state's leaders claimed as their own. In the 1780s and 1790s, They sold millions of acres, sometimes honestly, often through corruption in schemes like the infamous Yazoo land fraud, which would later haunt Georgia politics for decades. Still, new settlers poured in. Cotton, powered by the invention of the cotton gin in 1793, promised immense profit. The demand for enslaved labor soared, and Georgia's leaders embraced the plantation system wholeheartedly. By 1800, the colony, founded as a refuge for debtors, had become one of the Deep South's major slave states. As Georgia entered the 19th century, its contradictions deepened. It was expanding rapidly, economically ambitious, politically influential, and restless for more land. But that expansion came at the expense of the native nations who had lived there for centuries. Those conflicts and the moral fault lines of slavery would define the next era of Georgia's story. It was the dawn of the 18th century. The British Empire was expanding. Colonies stretched along the eastern coast of North America, but one final piece of the puzzle remained: a wild, untamed region south of the Carolinas. To the north was the growing colony of South Carolina. To the south was Spanish Florida, and in between lay a land of dense forests, rivers, and native nations, a buffer zone between empires. Britain looked at this land and saw opportunity and danger. You see, Britain didn't just want another colony for trade or farming. They wanted a shield, a colony that could stand between Spanish, Florida, and the valuable English settlements to the north. And beyond that, they dreamed of a new kind of society, one that could give poor English citizens, debtors, and persecuted Protestants a fresh start. So in 1732, King George II approved a plan. It was to be a new colony, a noble experiment named in his own honor, Georgia. The man behind this dream was James Oglethorpe, a British soldier, philanthropist, and visionary. He believed that Britain could solve two problems at once: defend its borders and help its people. In London's prisons, he saw men jailed not for crimes, but for debts they couldn't pay. He saw poverty, hunger, and hopelessness. Oglethorpe imagined a place where these people could build new lives, where hard work replaced despair, and where freedom meant a second chance. So, Oglethorpe gathered support, and in 1732, King George granted a royal charter to Oglethorpe and a group of 21 trustees. Their mission was clear: to found a new colony that would serve as both a humanitarian refuge and a military defense. But this wasn't a free-for-all like other colonies. Slavery, rum, and large plantations were banned. Georgia would be different: moral, disciplined, and self-reliant. At least, that was the plan. On November 17, 1732, the ship Anne set sail from England, carrying 114 settlers across the Atlantic. They were men, women, and children, ordinary people chasing extraordinary dreams. After a grueling voyage of nearly 2 months, they sighted land the coast of present-day South Carolina. From there, Oglethorpe led them south to a high bluff overlooking the Savannah River. There, in February 1733, he founded Savannah, the first settlement in Georgia. Oglethorpe's arrival wasn't met with hostility. Instead, he found allies among the Yamacraw, a Native American tribe led by Chief Tomochichi. The two men formed a remarkable friendship, one built on respect and diplomacy. Tomochichi offered land and guidance. Oglethorpe offered peace and trade. Their alliance became the foundation for Georgia's early survival. Without it, the colony might never have taken root. Savannah grew a city carefully planned, laid out in neat squares that still define its beauty today. The settlers built homes, farms, and forts. They endured heat, disease, and hunger. Yet they persisted. For a time, Oglethorpe's vision seemed to work: a society of equality and hard work. No slavery, no rum, no massive estates. It was a moral experiment, a living dream of reform. But dreams often collide with reality. The soil was poor for silk and grapes. The crops they had hoped would bring wealth. Disease spread. Many settlers grew restless. They looked north to South Carolina, where planters grew rich on rice and indigo with the help of enslaved Africans. Meanwhile, in Georgia, the settlers struggled. They demanded the right to own slaves, to drink rum, to own larger plots of land. Oglethorpe resisted, determined to protect his ideal colony. Yet the pressure grew, and so did resentment. Meanwhile, tensions with Spain escalated. Spanish Florida saw Georgia as an intrusion, an English colony planted too close to their borders. Raids and skirmishes broke out, and Georgia's true purpose as a buffer colony was tested. Oglethorpe, ever the soldier, took command. He built forts along the coast. Fort Frederica, Fort Street, Simons, and prepared for war. That war came in 1742 at the Battle of Bloody Marsh on St. Simon's Island. Spanish forces landed, determined to drive the British out. Outnumbered, Oglethorpe led his troops in a daring defense. Through skill, deception, and sheer courage, they repelled the Spanish attack. The victory secured Georgia for Britain and marked the end of Spanish ambitions in the region. Oglethorpe's vision, at least militarily, had succeeded. But soon after, Oglethorpe's dream began to fade. Discontent among settlers continued. They wanted the same freedoms as other colonies. In 1752, the trustees gave up their charter, and Georgia became a royal colony directly under the British Crown. The experiment was over. With royal control came sweeping change. Slavery was legalized. Large plantations began to appear. Wealthy planters moved in, and Georgia's economy shifted toward rice, indigo, and eventually cotton crops grown by enslaved Africans. What had once been a refuge for the poor now mirrored the very inequality Oglethorpe had tried to escape. Still, the colony thrived economically, its fertile lands along the coast and rivers turning profits for the empire. Yet beneath the surface, change was brewing, the kind of change that would soon shake all 13 colonies. For now, though, Georgia remained loyal, the youngest and most southern of Britain's American colonies, proud, prosperous, and unaware that revolution was just over the horizon. The year was 1763. The thunder of cannons had faded, and the British Empire stood triumphant after the French and Indian War. Yet victory came with a cost: mountains of debt and restless colonies. To London, the American colonies were no longer just partners. They were assets to be managed, taxed, and controlled. Across New England, anger began to rise. Protests over the Stamp Act, the Tea Act, the intolerable acts. But in Georgia, things were different. Georgia was young, loyal, and still dependent on British protection and trade. The colony's merchants relied on the crown, and its people, many of whom were new immigrants, had little appetite for rebellion. While Boston burned with fury and Philadelphia plotted revolution, Savannah remained cautious, even grateful to Britain. But history has a way of pulling everyone into its storm. As revolutionary fervor spread, Georgia found itself torn. On one side stood the Loyalists, men who feared chaos and believed their future still lay with the empire. On the other side were the Patriots, inspired by the cry for liberty, no taxation without representation. It was a clash, not just of politics, but of identity. Could Georgia, founded by idealists and loyal soldiers, truly turn against the very empire that had created it? In 1775, the first sparks of war reached Georgia's soil. A group of rebels, calling themselves the Liberty Boys, seized control of the royal gunpowder stores in Savannah. It was a bold act of defiance, Georgia's first open stand against British authority. Soon after, a provincial congress declared support for the United Colonies, and in 1776, Georgia joined its 12 neighbors in signing the Declaration of Independence. But freedom came at a price. The revolution was brutal for Georgia. The British quickly struck back, determined to reclaim their youngest colony. In 1778, British troops captured Savannah, turning it into a stronghold. For years, the city remained under British control, a fortress of redcoats deep in rebel territory. The war in Georgia became a nightmare of divided loyalties, neighbor against neighbor, loyalist against patriot. Families were torn apart, plantations burned, the countryside bled. In 1779, American and French forces launched a desperate attempt to retake Savannah. The siege of Savannah became one of the bloodiest battles of the Revolution. Over 4,000 troops, Americans, French, and even Haitian volunteers, fought bravely, but the assault failed. The city remained in British hands. Among the fallen was Count Casimir Pulaski, a Polish nobleman and hero of the Revolution. His sacrifice became legend, a symbol of courage in Georgia's darkest hour. Finally, in 1782, the British withdrew. Savannah was free again. Georgia, scarred and battered, emerged from the Revolution as one of the 13 independent states of America. But the struggle had changed everything. The old colonial order was gone. The people of Georgia were now citizens of a new nation, one still fragile, uncertain, and divided. In 1788, Georgia ratified the United States Constitution, becoming the fourth state to join the Union. For the first time, Georgians began to build their own government, their own destiny. The capital moved from Savannah inland to Augusta, and then to Louisville, as settlers pushed westward into new lands. The frontier was calling fertile soil, rivers, and endless forests waiting to be claimed. But there was a shadow over this expansion, one that would define Georgia's next century. The land they sought belonged to the Creek and Cherokee nations, native peoples who had lived there for generations. For a time, treaties were signed, promising peace and coexistence. But as more settlers arrived, the hunger for land grew unstoppable. Georgia's government began pressuring the federal government to remove Native Americans altogether. At the same time, Georgia's economy was changing. In the warm, humid soil of its southern plains, a new crop was taking root: cotton. The invention of the cotton gin in 1793 made it easier and faster to clean the fibers, turning cotton into the South's white gold. Plantations spread, wealth grew, and with it came an ever-increasing reliance on enslaved African labor. What had once been a struggling, idealistic colony had now become one of the South's most profitable states, but also one of the most unequal. In the fields, enslaved men and women toiled from dawn to dusk. In the cities, merchants and planters built fortunes from their suffering. Georgia was becoming rich, but at a terrible moral cost. By the early 1800s, the state was expanding rapidly: new towns, new counties, new ambitions. In 1802, Georgia agreed to give up its claims to western lands that would later become Alabama and Mississippi, in exchange for federal promises to remove native tribes from its borders. The stage was set for one of the most tragic chapters in American history. But before that, Georgia had another scandal to face: the Yazoo land fraud. It was a corruption scheme so massive it shook the young nation. In 1795, Georgia's legislature sold millions of acres of land, most of present-day Alabama and Mississippi, to private companies at absurdly low prices. Why? Because almost every legislator had been bribed. When the scandal broke, Georgians were furious. The sales were overturned, and the documents publicly burned in Louisville in a symbolic act of justice. But the damage was done. The episode became one of America's earliest examples of large-scale political corruption, and a warning of how greed could poison democracy. Still, Georgia pressed forward. The population grew, roads were built, and new settlers continued to pour in. By the early 19th century, Georgia had transformed from a defensive outpost to a booming state, ambitious, complex, and deeply conflicted. It had survived the Revolution, reinvented itself, and now stood at the crossroads of America's next great struggles: land, slavery, and power. By the dawn of the 19th century, Georgia had grown restless and ambitious. Its fertile lands and growing population made it one of the most dynamic states in the young republic. But beneath the prosperity, the tension between expansion, morality, and power began to deepen, and it would soon lead to conflict that tore the nation apart. The first great tragedy came with the removal of the Native Americans. For centuries, the Creek and Cherokee nations had lived across Georgia, cultivating their own farms, building schools, and even adopting aspects of American life in hopes of coexistence. But the more Georgia grew, the less room there was for its native peoples. Settlers wanted the rich farmland of North Georgia, and when gold was discovered there in 1892, everything changed. The Georgia gold rush sparked chaos. Thousands of fortune seekers flooded into Cherokee lands, seizing property and violating treaties. Rather than protecting the Cherokee, Georgia's government passed laws stripping them of their rights and sovereignty. The Cherokee Nation fought back, not with weapons, but with words, taking their case all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. In Worcester v. Georgia, 1832, the court ruled in favor of the Cherokee, declaring Georgia's actions unconstitutional. But President Andrew Jackson refused to enforce the decision. His infamous reply echoed through history: "John Marshall has made his decision. Now, let him enforce it." The result was the Trail of Tears. In 1838, thousands of Cherokee men, women, and children were forced from their homes and marched westward under military escort. The journey was brutal. Disease, starvation, and exposure killed roughly a quarter of those who walked. Their suffering left a permanent scar on Georgia's conscience. With the Cherokee and Creek removed, Georgia's interior opened for white settlement. Cotton plantations spread across the landscape, and with them, the brutal expansion of slavery. By 1860, enslaved African Americans made up nearly half the state's population. Cotton was everywhere from the red clay fields of Macon to the deep plantations of the coastal plains. It was the heart of Georgia's economy, its pride, and its curse. In cities like Savannah, Augusta, and Columbus, wealth poured in. The ports shipped millions of bales overseas, fueling textile mills in England and the North. Georgia's elite grew powerful politicians, planters, and merchants who saw themselves as masters of a prosperous empire, yet their wealth was built on human suffering. In the fields, enslaved families labored under the sun, bound by chains and overseen by whip. The moral and political conflict over slavery tore deeper into America's soul. As northern states called for its restriction, southern leaders warned of disunion. Georgia stood firmly with the South. When Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860, Georgians feared the end of their way of life. In January 1861, Georgia delegates met in Milledgeville, then the state capital, to decide their fate. After intense debate, the vote came, and Georgia chose to secede from the Union. The delegates declared that their rights and property, including slavery, were under threat, and they would stand with their southern neighbors. Georgia joined the Confederate States of America, and its governor, Joseph E. Brown, became one of the most ardent defenders of secession. Soon, the state that had once been the youngest colony was now a central battleground in America's bloodiest war. When the Civil War erupted in 1861, thousands of Georgians rushed to enlist. They fought bravely in some of the war's most famous battles, from Manassas to Gettysburg. Georgia's factories and railroads became vital to the Confederate war effort. The state's largest city, Atlanta, transformed into a hub of supply lines, weapons manufacturing, and troop movement. But the war would come home literally. In 1864, Union General William Tecumseh Sherman began his legendary March to the Sea. His goal: break the South's ability to fight by destroying its infrastructure and morale. His army of 60,000 men cut a fiery path across Georgia from Atlanta to Savannah, tearing up railroads, burning crops, and dismantling everything that sustained the Confederate war machine. In September 1864, after months of siege, Atlanta fell. Fires consumed the city. The destruction shocked the South and helped secure Lincoln's re-election. Sherman then marched toward the coast, his troops leaving a 60-mile-wide scar of ruin behind them. When they reached Savannah in December, Sherman spared the city, offering it to President Lincoln as a Christmas gift. The Civil War ended the following spring. The Confederacy collapsed. Slavery was abolished. The South lay in ashes, and Georgia, once the pride of the Confederacy, was devastated. Its cities burned, its economy shattered, its people broken. But from the ruins, a new Georgia would begin to rise. Reconstruction brought both hope and hardship. Federal troops occupied the state, enforcing emancipation and protecting the rights of freedmen. The Freedmen's Bureau helped former slaves find work, education, and a voice. For the first time in Georgia's history, black men voted and held office. In 1868, Henry McNeill Turner, an African-American minister, was elected to the state legislature, a moment that symbolized a new era. Yet that hope was short-lived. White supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan rose to terrorize freedmen and their allies. Reconstruction governments faced violent resistance, and many white Georgians longed to restore the old order. By the 1870s, federal troops withdrew, and the Redeemers, conservative Democrats, regained control. Slavery was gone, but oppression returned in new forms: sharecropping, black codes, and Jim Crow laws. For nearly a century, segregation and inequality defined life for black Georgians. Still, they persevered, building schools, churches, and communities that would later fuel the fight for civil rights. By the late 19th century, Georgia's economy began to rebuild. Railroads expanded, cotton mills grew, and cities like Atlanta rose from the ashes. Once a burned-out shell, Atlanta became a symbol of Southern resilience, a phoenix city reborn. Its motto, resurgence, meaning rising again, captured the spirit of a state determined to move forward, no matter the scars it carried. But even as Georgia rebuilt its cities and industries, the wounds of war and racial injustice remained open. The next century would test whether this reborn Georgia could truly deliver on the promise of freedom and equality for all its people. When the guns of the Civil War fell silent and the Union restored, Georgia faced the challenge of rebuilding not just its cities, but its soul. The war had ended slavery, but it had not ended injustice. Reconstruction promised equality, yet what followed was a painful century of struggle to make that promise real. By the 1870s, white Democrats calling themselves Redeemers had reclaimed political power in Georgia. They dismantled Reconstruction reforms and imposed strict racial segregation through Jim Crow laws. These laws divided public life by color schools, buses, restaurants, even water fountains, cementing a system designed to keep black Georgians in poverty and silence. For African Americans, the hope of freedom turned into a long fight for survival. Many became sharecroppers, working the same fields their ancestors had once tilled in bondage. Now trapped by debt and discrimination, lynchings and racial violence scarred the countryside. Yet even in those dark decades, a spirit of endurance took root. Black churches became sanctuaries of faith and strength. Schools, like Atlanta University, Morehouse College, and Spelman College, trained a new generation of leaders who would one day challenge the system itself. Meanwhile, Georgia's cities were changing. Atlanta, once burned to the ground by Sherman, rose from its ashes into the beating heart of the New South. By the early 1900s, it was booming with railroads, factories, and new industries. The city's skyline climbed higher each year, a symbol of progress, even as deep inequalities persisted below it. The early 20th century brought both tragedy and transformation. The Atlanta race riot of 1906 exposed the racial tensions simmering beneath Georgia's modern image. White mobs rampaged through black neighborhoods, killing dozens and destroying homes and businesses. Yet from the ruins came renewed determination. Atlanta's black middle-class doctors, educators, ministers continued to build. They believed that progress, however slow, was possible through perseverance and education. In the decades that followed, Georgia became a crossroads of old and new. While much of the state remained rural and bound to agriculture, cities like Atlanta and Savannah embraced industry and commerce. The Great Depression of the 1930s hit hard, devastating farms and families. But the New Deal programs brought hope: roads, schools, electrification. Young Georgians left the farms for factory jobs, and the balance of the state began to shift from countryside to city. One of those young men who rose through this changing South was Eugene Talmadge, a fiery populist governor who built his power on rural white voters and segregationist rhetoric. His era symbolized the Old South's last stand, a world where race and class divided people even as the modern age approached. But by mid-century, the winds of change were blowing again. World War II transformed Georgia. The war brought jobs and opportunity as military bases, shipyards, and aircraft factories sprang to life. Thousands of Georgians, black and white, served overseas, fighting for freedom. When they returned home, many began to question why that same freedom was denied to millions in their own country. The civil rights movement was about to begin, and Georgia would become one of its epicenters. In 1929, in a modest home on Auburn Avenue in Atlanta, a child was born who would change the world: Martin Luther King Jr. Raised in a community of faith and education, King absorbed the lessons of his father, the preaching of justice, and the moral power of nonviolence. As he grew, so did his conviction that love could defeat hate, and peace could overcome oppression. By the 1950s, the battle for civil rights had ignited across the South. Georgia saw its own sparks. In 1946, the white primary system, which had excluded black voters from the Democratic Party, was struck down, restoring political power to thousands. Yet resistance remained fierce. In 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court's Brown v. Board of Education decision ordered the desegregation of public schools. Georgia's leaders, including Governor Herman Talmadge, vowed defiance. Massive resistance became the rallying cry, and in 1958, the state even changed its flag to include the Confederate battle emblem, a symbol of defiance that would spark controversy for decades. But the movement could not be stopped. In 1960, students from the Atlanta University Center launched sit-ins at segregated lunch counters, demanding equal treatment. Their courage inspired others across the South. Martin Luther King Jr., then already a national figure after the Montgomery bus boycott, joined them, bringing the weight of moral authority to Georgia's own fight. The struggle grew marches, protests, arrests, and bombings. Yet, through it all, the movement held to its principle of nonviolence. King's message reached from Atlanta's churches to the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, where in 1963 he delivered his immortal "I Have a Dream" speech. Change, though slow and costly, began to take hold. In 1961, the city of Atlanta began desegregating its schools. In 1965, after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, barriers that had silenced black voters for generations finally fell. Georgia's political landscape began to shift. The years that followed were filled with both pain and progress. When Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in 1968, the nation mourned. In Atlanta, tens of thousands lined the streets to honor him. His coffin carried through the city he had called home. Yet, his dream did not die. It lived on in the next generations of Georgians, men and women of all races, who believed that justice could prevail. In the late 20th century, Georgia underwent another transformation. The old agricultural economy gave way to technology, business, and global trade. Atlanta became an international city, a crossroads of commerce and culture. The 1970s saw the rise of a new generation of leaders, including Maynard Jackson, Atlanta's first black mayor, who expanded the city's airport and opened government to all communities. In 1976, a peanut farmer from the small town of Plains, Georgia, Jimmy Carter, was elected President of the United States. His victory symbolized a new South, thoughtful, progressive, and committed to human rights. Carter's legacy as a humanitarian and peacemaker would continue long after his presidency, making him one of the most respected figures in modern American history. By the 1990s, Georgia was booming again. The 1996 Summer Olympics in Atlanta showcased a city reborn, a place where Southern tradition met global ambition. Millions watched as the torch burned over a city that had once burned itself, now a symbol of renewal. Today, Georgia stands as one of America's most dynamic states. Its economy ranks among the nation's strongest, driven by film production, aerospace, logistics, and technology. Its culture, rooted in history, music, and resilience, continues to shape the world, from the gospel choirs of Atlanta to the hip-hop that echoes far beyond its streets. Politically, Georgia has become a battleground once again, not of muskets or cannon fire, but of ideas and votes. The state that once seceded from the Union now decides the direction of the nation, its people reflecting the diversity and energy of modern America. Yet beneath the skyscrapers and highways, the past still whispers. From the red clay of its farmlands to the oak-lined streets of Savannah, the echoes of history remain. The story of Georgia is not one of perfection, but of perseverance, a journey from oppression to opportunity, from division to diversity, from the ashes of war to the heart of democracy. 3 centuries after its founding, Georgia still stands at the crossroads of the American story, where past and present meet, and the promise of a more just future continues to unfold. From the red clay fields to the marble halls of Atlanta, Georgia's story is one of resilience, reinvention, and relentless change. If you've enjoyed this journey through time, from colony to conflict to courage, make sure to hit that like button. Share this story with others who love history as much as you do. And don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into America's past. And tell us in the comments, which chapter of Georgia's history fascinated you the most? We'd love to hear your thoughts.